4. The Way of the Higher Man. Another portrait of the sage, elements of character, the golden rule. Wisdom, therefore, begins at home, and the foundation of society is a disciplined individual in a disciplined family. Confucius agreed with Goethe that self-development is the root of social development, and when Tse Lu asked him what constitutes the higher man, he replied, "The cultivation of himself with reverential care." Here and there throughout the dialogues we find him putting together, piece by piece, his picture of the ideal man, a union of philosopher and saint producing the sage. The Superman of Confucius is composed of 3 virtues, severally selected as supreme by Socrates, Nietzsche, and Christ: intelligence, courage, and goodwill. The higher man is anxious lest he should not get truth. He is not anxious lest poverty should come upon him. He is Catholic, not partisan. He requires that in what he says there should be nothing inaccurate. But he is no mere intellect, not merely a scholar or a lover of knowledge. He has character as well as intelligence. Where the solid qualities are in excess of accomplishments, we have rusticity. Where the accomplishments are in excess of the solid qualities, we have the manners of a clerk. When the accomplishments and solid qualities are equally blended, we then have the man of complete virtue. Intelligence is intellect with its feet on the earth. The foundation of character is sincerity. Is it not just an entire sincerity which marks the higher man? He acts before he speaks, and afterwards speaks according to his actions. In archery, we have something like the way of the higher man. When the archer misses the center of the target, he turns round and seeks for the cause of his failure in himself. What the higher man seeks is in himself. What the lower man seeks is in others. The higher man is distressed by his want of ability, not by men's not knowing him. And yet, he dislikes the thought of his name not being mentioned after his death. He is modest in his speech, but exceeds in his actions. He seldom speaks. When he does, he is sure to hit the point. That wherein the higher man cannot be equaled is simply this: his work, which other men cannot see. He is moderate in word and deed. In everything the higher man conforms with the path of the mean. For there is no end of things by which man is affected, and when his likings and dislikings are not subject to regulation, he is changed into the nature of things as they come before him. The higher man moves so as to make his movements in all generations a universal path. He behaves so as to make his conduct in all generations a universal law. He speaks so as to make his words in all generations a universal norm. He accepts completely the golden rule, which is here laid down explicitly 4 centuries before Hillel and 5 centuries before Christ. Chung Kung asked about perfect virtue. The master said, "Not to do unto others as you would not wish done unto yourself." The principle is stated again and again, always negatively, and once in a single word. Tse Kung asked, "Is there one word which may serve as a rule of practice for all one's life?" The master said, "Is not reciprocity such a word?" Nevertheless, he did not wish, like Lao Tse, to return good for evil, and when one of his pupils asked him, "What do you say concerning the principle that injury should be recompensed with kindness?" he replied more sharply than was his custom, "With what then will you recompense kindness? Recompense injury with justice, and recompense kindness with kindness." The very basis of the higher man's character is an overflowing sympathy towards all men. He is not angered by the excellences of other men. When he sees men of worth, he thinks of equaling them. When he sees men of low worth, he turns inward and examines himself. For there are few faults that we do not share with our neighbors. He pays no attention to slander or violent speech. He is courteous and affable to all, but he does not gush forth indiscriminate praise. He treats his inferiors without contempt and his superiors without seeking to court their favor. He is grave in deportment, since men will not take seriously one who is not serious with them. He is slow in words and earnest in conduct. He is not quick with his tongue or given to clever repartee. He is earnest because he has work to do, and this is the secret of his unaffected dignity. He is courteous even to his familiars, but maintains his reserve towards all, even his son. Confucius sums up the qualities of his higher man, so similar to the megalopsychos, or great-minded man, of Aristotle, in these words: "The higher man has 9 things which are subjects with him of thoughtful consideration. In regard to the use of his eyes, he is anxious to see clearly. In regard to his countenance, he is anxious that it should be benign. In regard to his demeanor, he is anxious that it should be respectful. In regard to his speech, he is anxious that it should be sincere. In regard to his doing of business, he is anxious that it should be reverently careful. In regard to what he doubts about, he is anxious to question others. When he is angry, he thinks of the difficulties his anger may involve him in. When he sees gain to be got, he thinks of righteousness. 5. Confucian politics. Popular sovereignty, government by example, the decentralization of wealth, music and manners, socialism and revolution. None but such men, in the judgment of Confucius, could restore the family and redeem the state. Society rests upon the obedience of the children to their parents and of the wife to her husband. When these go, chaos comes. Only one thing is higher than this law of obedience, and that is the moral law. In serving his parents, a son may remonstrate with them, but gently. When he sees that they do not incline to follow his advice, he shows an increased degree of reverence, but does not abandon his purpose. When the command is wrong, a son should resist his father, and a minister should resist his august master. Here was one root of Mencius's doctrine of the divine right of revolution. There was not much of the revolutionist in Confucius. Perhaps he suspected that the inheritors of a revolution are made of the same flesh as the men whom it deposed. But he wrote bravely enough in the Book of Odes, "Before the sovereigns of the Shang dynasty had lost the hearts of the people, they were the mates of God. Take warning from the house of Shang. The great decree is not easily preserved." The people are the actual and proper source of political sovereignty, for any government that does not retain their confidence sooner or later falls. Tse Kung asked about government. The master said, "The requisites of government are 3, that there should be sufficiency of food, sufficiency of military equipment, and the confidence of the people in their ruler." Tse Kung said, "If it cannot be helped and one of these must be dispensed with, which of the 3 should be foregone first?" "The military equipment," said the master. Tse Kung again asked, "If it cannot be helped and one of the remaining 2 must be dispensed with, which of them should be foregone?" The master answered, "Part with the food. From of old death has been the lot of all men, but if the people have no faith in their rulers, there is no standing for the state." The first principle of government, in the view of Confucius, is as the first principle of character, sincerity. Therefore, the prime instrument of government is good example. The ruler must be an eminence of model behavior, from which, by prestige imitation, right conduct will pour down upon his people. Kei Kong asked Confucius about government, saying, "What do you say to killing the unprincipled for the good of the principled?" Confucius replied, "Sir, in carrying on your government, why should you use killing at all? Let your evinced desires be for what is good, and the people will be good. The relation between superiors and inferiors is like that between the wind and the grass. The grass must bend when the wind blows across it. He who exercises government by means of his virtue may be compared to the North Polar Star, which keeps its place, and all the stars turn toward it." Kei Kong asked how to cause the people to reverence their ruler, to be faithful to him, and to urge themselves to virtue. The master said, "Let him preside over them with gravity, then they will reverence him. Let him be filial and kind to all, then they will be faithful to him. Let him advance the good and teach the incompetent, then they will eagerly seek to be virtuous." As good example is the first instrument of government, good appointments are the second. Employ the upright and put aside the crooked. In this way the crooked can be made to be upright. The administration of government, says the doctrine of the mean, lies in getting proper men. Such men are to be got by means of the ruler's own character. What would not a ministry of higher men do, even in one generation, to cleanse the state and guide the people to a loftier level of civilization? First of all, they would avoid foreign relations as much as possible, and seek to make their states so independent of outside supplies that it would never be tempted to war for them. They would reduce the luxury of courts, and seek a wide distribution of wealth, for the centralization of wealth is the way to scatter the people, and letting it be scattered among them is the way to collect the people. They would decrease punishments and increase public instruction. For there being instruction, there will be no distinction of classes. The higher subjects would be forbidden to the mediocre, but music would be taught to all. When one has mastered music completely and regulates his heart and mind accordingly, the natural, correct, gentle, and sincere heart is easily developed, and joy attends its development. The best way to improve manners and customs is to pay attention to the composition of the music played in the country. Manners and music should not for a moment be neglected by anyone. Benevolence is akin to music, and righteousness to good manners. Good manners, too, must be a care of the government, for when manners decay, the nation decays with them. Imperceptibly, the rules of propriety form at least the outward character, and add to the sage the graciousness of the gentleman. We become what we do. Politically, the usages of propriety serve as dikes for the people against evil excesses, and he who thinks the old embankments useless and destroys them is sure to suffer from the desolation caused by overflowing water. One almost hears the stern voice of the angry master echoing those words today from that hall of the classics, where once all his words were engraved in stone, and which revolution has left desecrated and forlorn. And yet Confucius too had his utopias and dreams, and might have sympathized at times with men who, convinced that the dynasty had lost the great decree or mandate of heaven, dragged down one system of order in the hope of rearing a better one on the ruins. In the end, he became a socialist and gave his fancy rein. When the great principle of the great similarity prevails, the whole world becomes a republic. They elect men of talents, virtue, and ability. They talk about sincere agreement and cultivate universal peace. Thus men do not regard as their parents only their own parents, nor treat as their children only their own children. A competent provision is secured for the aged till their death, employment for the middle-aged, and the means of growing up for the young. The widowers, widows, orphans, childless men, and those who are disabled by disease are all sufficiently maintained. Each man has his rights, and each woman her individuality safeguarded. They produce wealth, disliking that it should be thrown away upon the ground, but not wishing to keep it for their own gratification. Disliking idleness, they labor, but not alone with a view to their own advantage. In this way, selfish schemings are repressed and find no way to arise. Robbers, filchers, and rebellious traitors do not exist. Hence the outer doors remain open and are not shut. This is the state of what I call the great similarity. 6. The influences of Confucius. The Confucian scholars, their victory over the legalists, defects of Confucianism, the contemporaneity of Confucius. The success of Confucius was posthumous but complete. His philosophy had struck a practical and political note that endeared it to the Chinese after death had removed the possibility of his insisting upon its realization. Since men of letters never quite reconciled themselves to being men of letters, the literati of the centuries after Confucius attached themselves sedulously to his doctrine as a road to influence and public employment, and created a class of Confucian scholars destined to become the most powerful group in the empire. Schools sprang up here and there for the teaching of the master's philosophy as handed down by his disciples, developed by Mencius, and amended by 1,000 pundits in the course of time. And these schools, as the intellectual centers of China, kept civilization alive during centuries of political collapse, much as the monks preserved some measure of ancient culture and some degree of social order during the Dark Ages that followed the fall of Rome. A rival school, the legalists, disputed for a while this leadership of Confucian thought in the political world and occasionally molded the policy of the state. To make government depend upon the good example of the governors and the inherent goodness of the governed, said the legalists, was to take a considerable risk. History had offered no superabundance of precedents for the successful operation of these idealistic principles. Not men but laws should rule, they argued, and laws must be enforced until, becoming a second nature to a society, they are obeyed without force. The people are not intelligent enough to rule themselves well. They prosper best under an aristocracy. Even tradesmen are not too intelligent, but pursue their interests very often to the detriment of the state. Perhaps, said some of the legalists, it would be wiser for the state to socialize capital, monopolize trade, and prevent the manipulation of prices and the concentration of wealth. These were ideas that were destined to appear again and again in the history of Chinese government. In the long run, the philosophy of Confucius triumphed. We shall see later how the mighty Shi Huangti, with the legalist for his prime minister, sought to end the influence of Confucius by ordering that all existing Confucian literature should be burned. But the power of the word proved stronger than that of the sword. The books which the first emperor sought to destroy became holy and precious through his enmity, and men died as martyrs in the effort to preserve them. When Shi Huangti and his brief dynasty had passed away, a wiser emperor, Wu Ti, brought the Confucian literature out of hiding, gave office to its students, and strengthened the Han Dynasty by introducing the ideas and methods of Confucius into the education of Chinese youth and statesmanship. Sacrifices were decreed in honor of Confucius. The texts of the classics were by imperial command engraved on stone and became the official religion of the state. Rivaled at times by the influence of Taoism and eclipsed for a while by Buddhism, Confucianism was restored and exalted by the Tang Dynasty, and the great Dai Tsung ordered that a temple should be erected to Confucius and sacrifices offered in it by scholars and officials in every town and village of the empire. During the Sung Dynasty, a virile school of Neo-Confucians arose, whose innumerable commentaries on the classics spread the philosophy of the master in varied dilutions throughout the Far East and stimulated a philosophical development in Japan. From the rise of the Han Dynasty to the fall of the Manchus, that is, for 2,000 years, the doctrine of Confucius molded and dominated the Chinese mind. The history of China might be written in terms of that influence. For generation after generation, the writings of the master were the texts of the official schools, and nearly every lad who came through those schools had learned those texts by heart. The stoic conservatism of the ancient sage sank almost into the blood of the people and gave to the nation and to its individuals a dignity and profundity unequaled elsewhere in the world or in history. With the help of this philosophy, China developed a harmonious community life, a zealous admiration for learning and wisdom, and a quiet and stable culture, which made Chinese civilization strong enough to survive every invasion and to remold every invader in its own image. Only in Christianity and in Buddhism can we find again so heroic an effort to transmute into decency the natural brutality of men. And today, as then, no better medicine could be prescribed for any people suffering from the disorder generated by an intellectualist education, a decadent moral code, and a weakened fiber of individual and national character than the absorption of the Confucian philosophy by the nation's youth. But that philosophy could not be a complete nourishment in itself. It was well fitted to a nation struggling out of chaos and weakness into order and strength, but it would prove a shackle upon a country compelled by international competition to change and grow. The rules of propriety, destined to form character and social order, became a straitjacket, forcing almost every vital action into a prescribed and unaltered mold. There was something prim and Puritan about Confucianism, which checked too thoroughly the natural and vigorous impulses of mankind. Its virtue was so complete as to bring sterility. No room was left in it for pleasure and adventure, and little for friendship and love. It helped to keep woman in supine debasement, and its cold perfection froze the nation into a conservatism as hostile to progress as it was favorable to peace. We must not blame all this upon Confucius. One cannot be expected to do the thinking of 20 centuries. We ask of a thinker only that as the result of a lifetime of thought, he shall in some way illuminate our path to understanding. Few men have done this more certainly than Confucius. As we read him and perceive how little of him must be erased today because of the growth of knowledge and the change of circumstance, how soundly he offers us guidance even in our contemporary world. We forget his platitudes and his unbearable perfection and join his pious grandson, Kung Chi, in that superlative eulogy which began the deification of Confucius. Confucius handed down the doctrines of Yao and Shun as if they had been his ancestors, and elegantly displayed the regulations of Wen and Wu, taking them as his model. Above, he harmonized with the times of heaven, and below he was conformed to the water and land. He may be compared to heaven and earth in their supporting and containing, their overshadowing and curtaining all things. He may be compared to the 4 seasons in their alternating progress, and to the sun and moon in their successive shining. All-embracing and vast, he is like heaven. Deep and active as a fountain, he is like the abyss. He is seen, and the people all reverence him. He speaks, and the people all believe him. He acts, and the people are all pleased with him. Therefore his fame overspreads the Middle Kingdom, and extends to all barbarous tribes. Wherever ships and carriages reach, wherever the strength of man penetrates, wherever the heavens overshadow and the earth sustains, wherever the sun and moon shine, wherever frosts and dews fall, all who have blood and breath unfeignedly honor and love him. Hence it is said, he is the equal of heaven. 3. socialists and anarchists. The 200 years that followed upon Confucius were centuries of lively controversy and raging heresy. Having discovered the pleasures of philosophy, some men like Hui Zhe and Kung Sun Lung played with logic and invented paradoxes of reasoning as varied and subtle as Zeno's. Philosophers flocked to the city of Luoyang, as in the same centuries they were flocking to Benares and Athens, and they enjoyed in the Chinese capital all that freedom of speech and thought which made Athens the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. Sophists called Sun Heng Kia, or crisscross philosophers, crowded the capital to teach all and sundry the art of persuading any man to anything. To Luoyang came Mencius, inheritor of the mantle of Confucius, Zhuangzi, greatest of Lao Tse's followers, Shunzi, the apostle of original evil, and Mo Ti, the prophet of universal love.